to talk about the First Amendment double standard. Let's go back just a matter of 3 weeks? 3 weeks ago, when President Trump insisted that states should allow their people to go back to church. You should be able to reopen churches and make a point of it. And the media was all upset, all in a tizzy, about whether or not they were advancing proper social distancing guidelines or rushing things too fast, more erring on the side of the latter, moving forward too quickly. In cut 3, here is Kayleigh McEnany, White House press secretary, interacting with the press about that very topic, and see how they press her on that, how they push.
He wants to see all of those churches open in a safe fashion.
The governor does not allow that. Does the White House support churches defying these executive orders?
The president's been very clear. He wants to see churches reopen in accordance with his guidelines.
So the answer is yes?
I just gave you an answer. The president would like churches to reopen and do it in accordance with the guidelines.
What specific provision of federal law allows the president to override a governor's decision?
The president will strongly encourage every governor to allow their churches to reopen. And boy, it's interesting to be in a room that desperately wants to seem to see these churches and houses of worship stay closed.
The president said that he has that.
Kayleigh, I object to that. I mean, I go to church. I'm dying to go back to church. The question that we're asking you, and would like to have asked the president and Dr. Birx, is it safe? And if it's not safe, is the president trying to encourage that, or does the president agree with Dr. Birx that people should wait?
Jeff, it is safe to reopen your churches if you do so in accordance with the guidelines, which are laid out very stringent detail here about promoting hygiene practices, and there are 5 bullet points, and cloth face coverings. If social distancing is not possible, it's recommended. Intensifying cleanings, promoting social distance, we lay them out meticulously. So I am thankful that we have a president that celebrates the First Amendment. The same amendment that gives you all the ability to ask me questions is there to have the freedom of worship, so imams and pastors can go to their churches, can go to their places of worship, and can celebrate what is a First Amendment right in this country, which is to pray to your God and to practice your faith.
And we celebrate that too. I just want to follow up by saying we celebrate that too.
And so we
Certainly
should be
the First
thankful
Amendment
that there are
part.
guidelines
But
to
we're
allow
not-
us to
but we're not
re-engage in
asking-
that behavior.
We're not asking you if the president or people are allowing Americans to pray. That's not the
To
question
gather
that people
in their
are
places
asking
of
here.
worship, to attend church services, to pray together. And the president has laid out a clear path.
She's so right about to pray, by the way. It's not just about praying and being in your own home. It's about gathering together. Otherwise, no American should object when other countries, under totalitarian rule, prevent people from gathering in churches, like China. But I digress on that point. The only quibble I have with Kayleigh McEnany 3 weeks ago, and boy, does 3 weeks ago seem like a lifetime ago or what? But Kayleigh McEnany, when she said the First Amendment gives us these rights, no, she was right before. The First Amendment protects the rights of freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of religion. Those are 3 of the 5 rights of the First Amendment that are protected, guaranteed by the Constitution. But you listen to the media and the way in which they were posing the question, especially, his name escapes me, the last guy, asking, is it safe? This is the real question. Is it safe? And she says, yes, if it's done in accordance with the guidelines. When we had the protesters gathering at state capitals across the country over 3-4 weeks, arguing that the people, that's not these particular protests that you're seeing on the screen, but the protests of the government shutdowns that we saw for 3 or 4 weeks, when that was happening, when those protests were happening, the left was saying, how dare you, that's not safe. You should not be gathering outside the Capitol for that. But right now, nobody in the mainstream media is batting an eye at all at the gathering mass gatherings of, and let's put them up now, these peaceful protesters rallying together to say what happened to George Floyd was wrong, it was murder, and we need change. And in some cases to say some more extreme things, like let's defund or dismantle police departments. Let's disband the police. Now, I'm not saying that the media should be critical of those protests in that regard. I don't think they should have criticized those gathering together to protest their lives being forcibly put on hold by state governments and municipal governments across the country. They shouldn't have been griping about that in the first place, or pressing so hard, Kayleigh McEnany, about President Trump and his desire for people to go back to churches. But alas, that was 3 weeks ago. Now we are dealing with mass uprisings over an issue that the left deems important. I'm not saying that a lot of what the left has identified here isn't important. There are absolutely issues with police that need to be addressed. We especially talked about that in one of my monologues last week. What happened to George Floyd was absolutely, unquestionably, an unjust murder. And all 4 officers must be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law, as I have said from the beginning. But that does not mean that this particular rallying cry is somehow more justified, more appropriate, more righteous than people who have been told your lives must be put on the line or put aside, your businesses may be lost because of government restriction policies, and your rights must be suppressed by the government. Your fundamental rights to assemble and to speak. Those have been under attack for weeks in America. And only now is the media saying for this group, it's okay for you to protest. In fact, there are physicians. There's a medical organization that literally has said that because systemic racism is a massive issue in America, it's like an epidemic of its own, those protests are okay, and they're not going to be raising the alarm about social distancing or lack thereof and the spread of coronavirus at these protests. They're not crying about that specifically because they like the agenda of these particular protesters. You can't judge science and whether or not you should have a particular restriction based on the message being presented. That is the height of double standard. And Kayleigh McEnany in Cut 2 yesterday called attention a little bit to this using an opportunity in exchange with Fox News' John Roberts.
So I would note this. First, Dr. Burke sent me some new information before coming out here that new cases have stabilized, and many of the new cases are being identified through proactive monitoring and finding asymptomatic cases. Today, we saw the lowest new mortality report since the end of March, less than 500, and testing continues to expand with over 20 million done and more than 6% of Americans being tested, and in 7 states, nearly 10% of the population. So we are heading in a positive direction, even as we begin to safely reopen.
But again, has the president seen anything that causes him concern?
I would note again the encouraging signs put forward by Dr. Birx. He's seen the country safely reopen, and I would also just note some of the media contradictions here, certainly not referring to you specifically, John, but just a little more broadly, that there isn't an outcry about social distancing among the protests. And I mean, I saw one network with footage of the Ozarks and complaining about social distancing in the Ozarks, and then seamlessly transitioning into protest footage and not suggesting that there was a problem with the lack of social distancing. So I think we have to be very consistent.
So that was Kayleigh McEnany rightfully taking advantage of that opportunity. to say, I don't see the media, I don't see politicians talking about social distancing vis-a-vis these protests. They haven't from the start. This is the same Kayleigh McEnany at the very same kind of press briefing who just 3 weeks ago, let's just see a snippet again of this exchange with the reporter. I think he's a Reuters reporter. This is the exact same person, and just 3 weeks ago being pressed about going back to church.
Go to church. I'm dying to go back to church. The question that we're asking you and would like to have asked the president and Dr. Birx is it safe? And if it's not safe, is the president trying to encourage that, or does the president agree with Dr. Birx that people should wait?
Jeff,
So should people wait to protest a little bit longer? It was only 3 weeks ago. 1 week later, people were protesting about what happened to George Floyd. Again, rightfully so for the peaceful protesters. The point here is to say the double standard is clear. Public health researchers from the University of Washington were the ones who circulated a letter that, according to the Wall Street Journal, received 1,300 signatures from healthcare providers, epidemiologists, medical students across the country seeking to justify the difference between you shouldn't go rally together for this in public, you shouldn't go to church, versus these protests or memorials for George Floyd. On April 30th, heavily armed and predominantly white protesters entered the state capitol building in Lansing, Michigan, protesting stay-at-home orders and calls for widespread public masking to prevent the spread of COVID-19. Infectious disease physicians and public health officials publicly condemned these actions and privately mourned the widening rift between leaders in science and a subset of the communities they serve. As of May 30th, we are witnessing continuing demonstrations in response to ongoing, pervasive, and lethal institutional racism set off by the killings of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, among many other black lives taken by police. They continue. However, as public health advocates, we do not condemn these gatherings as risky for COVID-19 transmission because, quote, white supremacy is a lethal public health issue that predates and contributes to COVID-19. Read between the lines. We think this is an important issue of value. Therefore, it's okay to do it. We're not worried. If you dare to go against the mold of what is the orthodoxy today amidst these protests and riots, you might get fired as well. Now, this isn't a First Amendment issue because newspapers like the New York Times and Philadelphia Inquirer have every right to hire and fire whoever they want for whatever reason they want. Doesn't mean it's justified, doesn't mean it's right, but they can. The full editor of the Philadelphia Inquirer was fired over the past week, as was the opinion editor of the New York Times for articles published in their publications that more than anything disagreed with the prevailing notions of how you should think about and approach the issues of the day vis-a-vis the protests, the riots, policing, systemic racism, that idea, and more. Then let's go to cut 4. There's this growing movement to defund, dismantle, disband police departments across the country. And there is now majority support. I think it's 9-3. At least 9 of the Minneapolis city council members are on board with defunding and dismantling their police department. That's going to take time, not going to be a quick move. Maybe they'll do what a couple of other police departments did in the past after being dissolved, which was become essentially subsumed under a county sheriff's office or something. But here's how she expressed her views in this regard. This is the city council president for Minneapolis.
Do you understand that the word dismantle or police free also makes some people nervous? For instance, what if in the middle of the night my home is broken into? Who do I call?
Yes, I mean, I hear that loud and clear from a lot of my neighbors. And I know, and myself too, and I know that that comes from a place of privilege. I know that that comes from a place of privilege. I know that that comes from a place of privilege. I know that that comes from a place of privilege, because for those of us for whom the system is working, I think we need to step back and imagine what it would feel like to already live in that reality, where calling the police may mean more harm is done. And so in the very immediate, we have to lean into whatever changes we can make in our existing police department. You know, I think we look to cities like Camden, New Jersey, that completely restructured their department as we build up systems. And we've already done that. We are not starting from scratch. We have invested in community-based safety strategies. We have knowledge in our community across the city. We've done an analysis of all the reasons people call 911 and have looked at ways we can shift the response away from armed police officers into a more appropriate response for mental health calls, for some domestic violence calls, for health-related issues. And so the groundwork is laid already in Minneapolis for us to build on that, to learn from folks around the world, but really also to listen to our community and put those community voices front and center as we build up those systems even further.
Now, I will say this. I agree with her that there are a lot of things that could be done differently to address different circumstances. That's entirely merited. Some of what she said there is definitely worthy of being considered and implemented in terms of reforms. I'm entirely on board with engaging in that conversation. However, how she began that question was by saying, okay, if you are worried about your safety and you want to call the police and you're asking, what am I going to do to protect myself? Who do I call? That comes from a place of privilege, particularly because the individual, presumably, like the anchor on the show, Allison Camerata, is white. And therefore, coming from a position of white privilege where police tend to be, the argument goes, better treating of you, you have privilege. So you need to be first thinking, oh, this comes from a place of privilege. But then later on in her answer, she says we need to listen to the community members. But didn't earlier in the beginning of that answer, the Minneapolis City Council president, didn't she say that comes from a place of privilege and essentially dismiss the complaint? Isn't she dismissing the interests or the desires of particular groups within the community? And then there's also the narrowly tailored objectives of some of these protesters who don't seem to be interested fully in genuine reforms that are meaningful and practical, but simply about the radical steps like defunding police. The mayor of Minneapolis, Jacob Frey, went before a crowd of these protesters, not literally on bended knee here, but he might as well have been. And while he was there trying to be conciliatory and to listen and pay his respects to the cause, he ended up getting booed. Take a listen to this.
You have to take responsibility here. I've been coming to grips with my own brokenness in this situation, my own failures, my own shortcomings, and I know there needs to be deep-seated structural reform in terms of how the department operates. The systemically racist system needs to be revamped. The police union needs to be put in its place. We need to make sure that everything from the union contract to the way that the arbitration functions to the way that our officers and the culture in the department behaves, it all change. Jacob, I'm not supporting full abolition of the
all right, get the go home. Go home, Jacob, go home. Go home, Jacob, go home. Go home, Jacob, go home.
So that is an example of some, particularly leaders of some of these protests, basically saying you must go to the extreme or else you need to go home. He said he doesn't support abolishing the police department. And they yelled at him, go home, Jacob, go home. That's the kind of intolerance that we're getting when we're told this perspective is worthy of mass protests where you don't have any regard for social distancing. This perspective is worthy of shouting down the mayor and sending him home if he doesn't agree. This perspective is worthy of firing longtime editors of publications who may have brought Pulitzers to that publication because they said the wrong thing or allowed the wrong article to get published. Where are we at as a society where you must agree full stop with one view and you can't have a more complex view? I'm running late here, but I do want to play one more clip real quick. This is Attorney General William Barr. Let's drop it in, Nathan Matoush. Cut 7 with Margaret Brennan of Face the Nation, who I think does a fantastic job, actually. I think she does a really good job. Take a listen to a little bit of this exchange.
Policing is the toughest job in the country, and I frankly think that we have generally the vast overwhelming majority of police are good people. They're civic-minded people who believe in serving the public. They do so bravely. They do so righteously.
But and the bad cops?
I think that there are instances of bad cops, and I think we have to be careful about automatically assuming that the actions of an individual necessarily mean that their organization is rotten. All organizations have people who engage in misconduct, and you sometimes have to be careful as to when you ascribe that to the whole organization and when it really is some errant member who isn't following the rules.
But doesn't the opening the pattern of practice investigation to a place like Minneapolis, where there are questions about the broader issues with policing, it wasn't just the one officer, wouldn't that answer that question?
Well, that's exactly the reaction that I think has been a problem in the past, which is it just, again, just reacting to this incident by immediately putting the department under investigation doesn't necessarily result in improving the situation. But I would say that in the first instance, the governor has announced an investigation of the police department.
So just a couple quick thoughts before we head to a break here. First of all, overall, I think Bill Barr is doing a tremendous job. I think he's a very honorable guy. And I also think that Margaret Brennan, as far as mainstream anchors and reporters go, is top of the business. Like, she genuinely does, I think, a really good, very fair job and strives for that fairness. But Bill Barr, I think, well, he's right that we shouldn't label all police departments in one way because of some bad apples. We also do have to recognize something. And this is where I'm going to give some credit to the protesters, peaceful protesters who've identified this, which is that there is a blue shield. There is a culture of protection specifically for police officers, especially from the union. That's one thing Jacob Frey mentioned, the mayor of Minneapolis as well, is the union's role. The police union is a big part of the problem protecting, shall we say, dirty cops or cops accused of improprieties. And I do think that we need to recognize that these police departments may have a cultural problem going on. In many cases, they do. That does not mean that we should just brand all of them, brand all the police officers, say it's this way or that way, no matter what. But it does mean that we should be open to exploring police departments and that there are issues. If there's an issue and it seems to be covered up, Minneapolis, there seems to have been issues for a long time, then we will address it. We will address the overall department and those issues involved. So I think we need to take a nuanced view, a more in-depth and substantive view, but we also need to exclude those double standards. This is nonsense what's happening in our society. If you go along with the orthodoxy, you're okay. Social distancing be damned. If not, well, then you should probably just stay at home. We need to really think long and hard about where we go as a people from here. You just watched a clip from Jimmy at the Crossroads. Don't miss more engaging, intelligent talk. Subscribe to the Jimmy at the Crossroads YouTube channel today. You want to catch our live show. And I love your support.
I got Jimmy at the crossroads, making sense out of no sense. Yeah.